Hello. Thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott in Oxford in the UK, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, DC, to the 39th jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice, Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Use, please, the Q&A button, not the chat button. These questions will come to me during the session, and I will try to put them into some kind of order for the panel to consider towards the end. We urge you to ask questions as and when they occur to you so that we don't get a bottleneck at the end. I'm looking forward greatly to this conversation today. Over to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Mike. And we're delighted to be talking today about an unusual situation of an election year when there are dozens, scores of countries holding national leadership elections. Some have done so already and are doing so almost every day at the moment. And to talk about the meaning of the international trends that we might see and speculate on how the world might change as a result of this year's elections. As Mike said, we have a very distinguished panel, 5 people today rather than the usual 4 because we're trying to cover such a broad canvas. Very happy to have back with us Baroness Jenny Randerson, member of the British House of Lords since 2012, and a member of the Liberal Democratic Party in the United Kingdom. Also with us is Fernando Cervantes, a professor at the University of Bristol, a historian in the United Kingdom. He specializes in early modern European and Latin American intellectual history. Louis Goodman is professor and dean emeritus at the School of International Service at American University and has done path-breaking research on social change in politics in Latin America and in Asia as well. And it makes a particular point of following elections around the world and trying to chart what's happening. Moses Tacey, we're happy to have with us, who is a professor of political science and international relations at Middle Tennessee State University, not too far from Nashville. He teaches courses in African politics, Middle East politics, international relations, and international development. He's a graduate of nearby Vanderbilt University. Shenzhuan Nancy Wei is a professor at Wenzhou Kean University, and she previously taught at University of Bridgeport. She is here to talk about East Asian and Pacific Rim issues and others that she is concerned with, and we're happy to have everyone. I want to start with Professor Cervantes, with Fernando, and ask you, Fernando, if you remember to unmute yourself, whether this is really a major moment, all these elections, or is this a sort of conceit that we are at some fulcrum point in watching the possibility for major change in the world to sort of cheer us up or make us less happy by talking about the stakes this year? What do you think?
Well, I'm wary of making predictions, but as a historian, I can't help but see very interesting parallels with situations in the past that led to quite a lot of populism, which is what we're seeing now. If you just cast your mind back to the years after the First World War, just think about T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Do you remember the last lines of the poem where he said that the kingfisher is going to shore up fragments against ruins there's a very strong consciousness there that the humanist tradition was in crisis and that it needed to be rethought and re-explained from a very fresh perspective, which is what he tries to do. But of course, we all know that it didn't lead to, although a lot of people were reading the poem and thinking about it, what came next was pretty calamitous, wasn't it? The Wall Street crash made people lose faith completely in the 19th century optimism and theory of progress. And this gave rise to the populist movements that we saw leading to the emergence of fascism, National Socialism, and communism. The interference of the state was something that was widely welcome as a the solution to the problems that people were seeing at the time. I can't help but think that what we're seeing now is very, very similar. That we are in danger of heading in that direction unless we heed T.S. Eliot, who was, of course, in fundamental agreement with Nietzsche. Nietzsche had more or less seen through the crisis of humanism in the 19th century, and the fact that it really was a spiritual problem that we were facing, rather than anything that could be solved by appealing to economics or political science, or anything. We needed to go deeper.
Well, thank you. We'll certainly come back and depend on your historical perspective as we talk about things that are happening this year. I'd like to go to Lou Goodman, who makes a particular point of following elections, and Lou, ask you, how does it look so far, a month and a half into 2024?
Well, I agree with Fernando that we're at an important point, and it's useful to compare with what happened after World War I. But I think that the comparison shows the differences between the current situation and what happened after World War I. The vindictive settlements, especially against Germany at the Treaty of Versailles, led to political collapse, not only in Europe, but also in the United States. And after World War II, the great powers, you can see the difference between the settlements with Germany and Japan, tried very hard to set something up that didn't collapse that way. And here we are again in the beginning of the 20s at a situation where the world could go in a vindictive a fashion in which nations didn't connect with each other, or it could move in a direction in which people are engaged. And so far, I'm optimistic about what's going to happen in the 2020s. I'm especially optimistic because of the election that happened yesterday in Indonesia, where the forces that wanted to strengthen ASEAN and strengthen Indonesia, the fourth largest country's engagement with the world, won decisively. I'm also encouraged by a number of the elections in Latin America, an area that I pay attention to, that seem to be moving in the right direction. Of course, we have to look ahead to the elections in the United States and in Mexico and in many other countries. But I think there's room for optimism, but also there could be collapse. So each year will be important in the years to come. There's more middle powers that we need to pay attention to, but I'm an optimistic person. I'm hoping that that's going to be the outcome.
Thanks. So Nancy, your Taiwan has already had an election that's been described by many people as very significant and setting up a potential crisis with People's Republic of China in the not too distant future. And I wonder how you put that into context and think about other elections coming up in Asia.
Thank you for this. I wanted to add to what Lou and Fernando just talked about, since both covered the history part. So I wanted to start with the history. The Taiwan issue is, at the end of the Chinese Civil War, when the defeated nationalists moved from mainland China to Taiwan. And the interesting thing, because both scholars have just talked about how history and the settlement at the end of World War I and World War II actually affect this situation. So I'm going to also take this the Taiwan issue back to history and put it in at the end of World War II. It's interesting, when the war was over, Taiwan was returned to China de facto. But then Chinese civil war produced a result, which is a communist one, and nationalist was driven to the island Taiwan. And then the United States and China saw each other in the on the Korean Peninsula. And immediately when the war started, and then the East Asians settlement of the territorial of the World War II produced a result which is disputed up to this day, because even though not many people talk about it, and I wanted to mention that, the San Francisco Peace Treaty did not invite mainland China nor Taiwan. Two Chinese governments, neither of them were invited. And it did not invite neither North Korean nor South Korean. So these two critical players were not invited to the San Francisco Peace Treaty. So as a result, many of today's East Asians' problems can trace to that San Francisco Peace Treaty. So I wanted to briefly talk about that. And then I want to talk about this issue of Taiwan's election. The election produced, it's a very interesting situation. The winner, Mr. Lai Qingde, he got 40% of the vote, but he's the one that is viewed as most hawkish toward mainland China. And then on the other hand, the two the oppositional parties, the KMT, which is the Chiang Kai-shek's party that was eventually moved out of mainland China, eventually ended up in Taiwan. And that party got to the second, and then it now controls the parliament. And then the new party that's just a few years old party called the Taiwan People's Party, which won only 8 votes in the parliament, but they won 26% of the popular vote, the electoral vote, which means that the two opposition parties put together, they want to have a better relationship with China. And yet the voter turned out to a president, which is also wanted to have more. Actually, the president, Mr. Lai Qingde, currently the VP, and he won the presidency with only 40% of the vote, because Taiwan's electoral system is the first past the post system. And so the interesting thing is that the people wanted to have a better relationship with mainland China, yet the president is one that traditionally wanted to have an independent Taiwan. So here's the situation. So we have 3 candidates, and then 2 superpowers, United States and China, and then 1 island, which is strategically important. So this 3-2-1 is going to affect about not only the Asia Pacific, it's going to also affect the Americans, the election. So Donald Trump versus President Biden, so the two, whichever one, it's going to have a significant impact on the situations across the Taiwan Strait, and also on the North Korean and South Korean situations there as well.
Thank you, Nancy. We'll come back to you in a bit, but Moses, I wonder, before we go to Jenny Randerson for an overview from the Parliament, I wanted to ask you what particular spots in Africa, you're originally from Cameroon, I believe, and what you would be advising people to watch in Africa this year, what's happened so far, what will happen ahead. Some elections, I think, were postponed in Senegal, if I'm not mistaken. What do you expect in 2024 in Africa?
Well, I think I'm optimistic in certain ways, but also pessimistic in many ways. First, the Senegalese election, for example, has been postponed, and that has really drawn the bitterness among Senegalese. But indeed, there are a lot more about the postponement that basically we do not really see. So when we consider the situation in the Sahelian Africa, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, we find that coup d'etats returned to that area, and that democratic governance has really retreated to the backbone. Now, we also find that we had successful elections in Nigeria. We had a successful election in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and then in Kenya. And I expect we're going to have successful elections in Ghana. That basically leads to optimism. Now, the South African situation, I think about it in an optimistic way because the ANC had dominated politics for the past 30 years. Now, the polls suggest that they've been losing ground. And we have other parties, the Democratic Alliance, the Freedom Front Party, Economic Freedom Front Party of Julius Malema. And all of these really are opening up the South African system. And because of the way the system works there, the fact that the ANC might end up not winning a majority, but indeed winning a plurality, in which case calling for some type of a coalition government, is good for democracy because indeed probably some of the problems that have plagued South Africa all these years because of the ANC dominance, problems of corruption, problems of crime, and youth unemployment and so forth could be better resolved when we have a much wider spectrum. So those give me a lot of optimism. But then we cannot also forget that we have the problems in Mozambique associated with ISA's Islamic affiliates there, plaguing in instability. So when we look at those things, we then begin to see that indeed stable democratic governance probably will bring greater consensus in terms of generating the type of policies that can deal with the massive problems that various African countries face, problems of high youth unemployment, problems of corruption, problems of wars and civil wars and other communal conflict. And so these types of problems, climate change, I must also mention, and then the Islamist problems associated with other countries besides just the Sahelian conflict, will really require that we have a greater consensus within the various countries to address these problems. So those are the reasons for my optimism and for my pessimism.
Okay, thank you. A good summary. Jenny Randerson, you've been watching politics for a long time. You've participated in government of Wales. You're in the Liberal Democratic Party, which has a very crucial role between the two larger parties. And I'm wondering how you see, I'd of course like some words about what we can expect in the United Kingdom. It's not clear whether the election will be in this calendar year or just after the end of it. But also your thoughts on how nervously people in Europe may be watching the American election coming up.
Well, I think the people nervously watching in Europe are a pale shadow of the nervous watching within the UK. By the standards of the world, many countries in the world, the UK is very politically stable. But in recent years, we have had what we regard as political chaos. We have had a whole succession of prime ministers. We have, we often reel off in the House of Lords, that we've had 22 ministers for the post office in the last 20 years. How can anyone get a grip on individual departments when you've got that rate of change. So there is a strong view in Britain among politicians and among organizations that interlink with politicians and interlink with the civic process. There's a strong view that we should expect a change. And I think members of the Conservative Party would say probably the same thing. But we do have an unusually old-fashioned electoral system, first past the post. We also have a government which, as it has become less popular, has been nibbling at the edges of our democracy. And we have, of course, no written constitution. So nothing to stop that happening. And this is just a few things. Increases in the amount of money that you can spend at an election, big increases, when actually only one party is in a position to spend up to the limits. Changing the status of the Electoral Commission so they become subject to the government rather than independent. There are issues about larger constituencies that are now in place, and so on. We can go through that. And that's all against the background of the most populist campaign we have ever seen, I think, in my lifetime. There's a big use of wedge issues like immigration, transgender issues, green issues, government coming out as the motorist's friend, and so on. And you've also got a divided governing party. But I think you should, observers should be wary of becoming too sure that the government, despite its current unpopularity, is definitely going to lose the election when they choose to call it. And remember, that's up to them when they call it. Because we've seen in Britain in this last week events which have really destabilized the Labour Party. And there is a sort of famous saying in Britain that you've got to take into account events, dear boy, events. And we've had events this week connected with a Labour candidate and apparent anti-Semitic statements. And that has really thrown the spotlight onto the Labour Party and its processes. Now, if you take all that against the background of a troubled world, escalating issues in the Middle East, the Ukraine, and the fact that Europe as a whole is drifting to the right in its politics, I think you shouldn't bet too much money on the Conservative Party necessarily losing the election. But I say that as a Liberal Democrat. You know, I am clearly hopeful that liberal democracy is going to flourish. But the point is that we have an electoral system in Britain which means that Nancy said earlier on about how, I can't remember which election you were referring to, Nancy, but you were referring to someone only getting 40% of the vote but winning. And I thought, happens all the time in Britain. So you just have to bear that in mind, of vagaries of our electoral system.
And just very briefly, how watchfully and nervously are Britons and others in Europe watching the American campaign as it evolves?
Oh, I think we're watching very carefully, because we see an awful lot of it on our media, and we have been we've been captured by big personality politics ourselves in the last few years with Boris Johnson. Now, He seems to have faded from center stage at the moment, but there are stories about him returning. But the Trump phenomenon, we watch with surprise because, in many ways, because we've always been taught American democracy is rock solid because of the Constitution. But the people watch with great interest and really amazement at the power of a big personality in that way. And clearly, it will influence our election if it happens to be that the election in the States is held roughly at the same time as ours. And at the moment, the view is that Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, will not be calling an election perhaps in the spring because he's too far behind in the polls. He'll wait and hope that things improve. But the problem with waiting is that the American election will overshadow it. Of course, at the same time, if he doesn't go in the spring, he will also have to contend with the impact of the EU elections, 500 million people, all the signs there that the EU result will skew to the right this time. I know we have had this before with EU elections. Oh, it's going to be more right-wing. And it actually hasn't turned out that way. But there is signs now that the right-wing and the ultra-right in Europe are much stronger and will deliver a stronger result this time. And that election, of course, is due in the early summer.
Well, one election that I know Americans are wondering about and watching with great interest is the one coming in Mexico. And I wonder if Lou and Fernando might both have some comments to offer. First of all, it's an unusual situation for Mexico, that precedent-shattering fact that there are two women candidates who are facing off against each other. And there could be some important ramifications for events on the southern border of the United States, which, as we know, has been very turbulent recently. Lou, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about it. And I think that it's very important to look at elections not just because of their impact on the country in which they're happening, but also on their global impact. And Joe Biden being elected president of the United States instead of Donald Trump made a huge impact on international relations, bringing NATO back together, bringing our Asian allies, Korea and Japan, together with the European allies to oppose the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so people that I know throughout the world are really watching the US election because they think there'd be a different kind of leadership if Donald Trump was elected. And leadership isn't just important in the United States. For example, in Africa, there's going to be an important election in Rwanda. And even though there's lots of questions about Kagame's presidency, he's been the leading force getting the East African community and the African Union to begin to do things. So leadership can be very important. In Mexico, in the United States, we're not really that aware of the kind of leadership that Andrés Manuel López Obrador has wanted to bring to Mexico. He's described his presidency as the fourth transformation of Mexico, the first one since the Mexican Revolution in 1910. And he's describing it as something that's taking away the privileges of the elites and basically wanting to lead the government towards a government that can really focus on development and deal with the security issue overall. But he's not been able to do that as he wished because he didn't have control of Congress. This next election, while it's interesting to see that there's two women running and that the likely winner is going to be someone in López Obrador's party, who's a Jewish woman, being the first woman and the first Jew to be president of Mexico, if she has coattails that brings 2/3 of the people in her party to control Congress, then it will be possible for them to do this transformation and to begin to change the structure of Mexico overall. And that would happen in a remarkable moment, which is 2024, when there also will be an election in the United States. So if Claudia Sheinbaum becomes president and Joe Biden is president, can they begin to, as part of the transformation of Mexico and the continuing politics of the United States, have greater cooperation on migration issues, on security issues, on North American integration to make North America more of a powerhouse? So no election determines everything, but the Mexican election is a very important election, and there's the possibility of a national transformation there that most people in the United States are not aware is on the agenda. I'll end there.
Fernando, do you have comments to add about the Mexican election and others coming up in Latin America?
Well, I don't think I could add much more to what Luis has already said. I think it was a very, very interesting summary. Except that, you know, from the outside, I've been observing the last 6 years of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and one thing is the rhetoric, the populist rhetoric that he puts across, which of course gives him enormous support. And the other thing is what actually has been done, which is hasn't been enormously successful. And I can't see that Claudia will be able to carry on. You know, I think it's very likely that the election that she will win the election. The government has about 60% support, but it is very much among the people who are very disillusioned with democracy itself. You know, with liberalism, with neoliberalism, the elites. So this fourth transformation that he's talking about, if you look at the way in which he looks at Mexican history, the first one was independence. So break away from 300 years of nasty corruption by European powers. That's how he sees independence. Secondly, it was the liberal reform implemented in the middle of the 19th century by Juárez, the indigenous president, that implemented a liberal reform, extremely anti-clerical, extremely anti-elite. The third one was the Mexican Revolution, sort of a social movement there with very popular roots. And that's what he wants. So he wants to dissociate Mexico from any kind of Western legacy. He wants to stress its indigenous roots, which, as we all know, are of course a little bit of a myth because they emerged in the 20th century in a country that is fundamentally a miscegenated country. So this idea that going back to indigenous roots is going to solve the problems is a myth, and I'm worried because the way in which it's being presented is very much among the lines of populism and calling to emotions rather than to reasoned argument. So I'm not very optimistic, I'm afraid. I am naturally an optimist, but at the moment, I can't see things in a very positive light.
There's a theme here.
Yeah, I don't think it's really appropriate to see ourselves as optimistic or pessimistic about Mexico. Fernando, one of the things that strikes me is that, you know, the Mexican presidency usually lasts 6 years. In the first 2 years, there's optimism, the president's going to do something. The second 2 years, corruption starts. And the last 2 years, they're a total lame duck, and they're basically totally unpopular. And AMLO has prevented that from happening. It's the first time in my lifetime that in the last 2 years, a Mexican president has had coattails going on into the next one. And so it's a different situation in Mexico than it was today. Now, this populist rhetoric, as you say, gives him lots of popularity, and his record of improving income distribution, of diminishing crime is terrible, and the militarization of the armed forces has been terrible. However, as you may have noted, Mexico just last month passed China as the major trading partner of the United States. Now, whether that's a sign of Mexico's economy picking up, and whether I don't think he's going to, if they had the fourth transformation, it's not going to transform it to its indigenous roots. I think the aim is to make it more of a development state, like Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, like Kagame wants to make Rwanda. And is that possible with the huge inequality that exists in Mexico? and the anti-incumbency that's usually there because the system has been broken for some time, and people have been so disappointed that it wasn't fixed once the PRI went out of power. So I think it's a really fascinating election to see. It's full of potential for important change, that it'll be affected both by what happens with the congressional elections in Mexico and also the possible partnership with the United States.
Nancy, I don't know how far your Asian bailiwick extends, but I wonder if you have some thoughts about what's been happening in the Indian subpeninsula in Pakistan and Bangladesh, for example.
Interestingly, in Pakistan, we're seeing the situation that both candidates declare that they won. So that's, a country cannot have two presidents at the same time, right? I remember some time ago in Africa, in a coastal country, then that both candidates declared victory. So Pakistan is going to continue to be destabilized because of this situation. India, at the same time, will be happy to see that its opponent being weakened through this situation. On the other hand, my focus actually on East Asia, typically the situations between Taiwan and mainland China, and I think that's a much bigger concern. The current situation is that, as I stated earlier, Mr. Lai is not going to have an easy time govern the next 4 years. First of all, domestically, there are wild cards because of his party is not having the majority in the legislature. So he has to work with other parties, especially the third one, a new party, the Taiwan People's Party. They only won 8 votes, but they are the critical 8. In order to get anything passed, he has to have Mr. Lai needs 8 more votes on his side so that he can get a majority. So he has compromise in this situation. So that's domestically. Taiwan Strait, he faces the mainland China with President Xi is increasingly militarily capable. And then also China has more tools in the toolbox to pressure his side. And across the Pacific Ocean, we're seeing that the United States is going through an election, and then the situation is not very predictable. And another part, which many of us have probably have not thought of, now going to join Ukraine and Israel to compete for America's attention and weapons and also funds. So that's another part why this whole thing is all connected. I just wanted to mention that.
Sure. Just quickly, Indonesia, the election just held in Indonesia. Do you have any thoughts about it?
I do agree with earlier, I believe it was Fernando and Lou mentioned that it's actually a positive. So I actually think that's a positive for the region. Overall, there are, I do not necessarily think that it's going to be a war in a region or major conflict. There are mixed results. Some of these are, generally positive, and others are not that. So it's a mixed situation. And also it depends on the interactions between these different elections and the results in the United States.
Thank you. Moses, Lou mentioned President Kagame of Rwanda. It's an extraordinary thing that this tiny country, Rwanda, in terms of land area, it must be one of the very smallest in Africa, should emerge on the national scene. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has had a scheme which I think fell on some negative results earlier this week, but to ship would-be migrants to the United Kingdom to Rwanda. And so how do you explain this outsized attention to Rwanda and Kagame's potential re-election at this point?
It reminds me of at one conference in Addis Ababa, I think in 2012, one of the participants who had actually been a part of the contingent of exiled Rwandans in Uganda, and then marched in to really bring order to the situation caused by the massacres. I asked him about Kagame. He told me, well, he was a dictator. Of course, we know that what he did in terms of after the Rwandan genocide was really laudable. Now, I would say that I think is the perspective of some in the West, because Rwanda is a classic example of an autocrat. And it probably, some would say it's a benevolent autocrat because he's done quite a lot for Rwanda. But at the same time, there are other things that he's really not done well. As far as democracy is concerned, that's one of the things. In terms of leadership, of course, his leadership is there. In fact, he even once, I'm quoting from a colleague at the African Development Bank when I was there at around 2011, who told me that he was in the room when Kagame asked Obasanjo, then president of Nigeria, considering to change the constitution in order to run after the term limit, asked Obasanjo that he should not have done that. That is to say, he should not have followed the rules of the term limit and therefore just not run, because they needed Obasanjo, Africa needed him, and of course himself, Kagame. So indeed, leadership, of course, is important, but let's talk about leadership in a democracy, democratic leadership. And when we look at the leadership from that perspective, then, of course, Kagame fails that test. Of course, there are many other violations relating to human rights and other civil liberties that basically takes place. But in terms of building Rwanda as a country, in terms of infrastructures, economic, and even leadership in fighting conflicts in Africa. You know, Rwanda was one of the countries that sent troops to help fight the Islamists in Mozambique. But at the same time, Rwanda has also been a problem in Eastern DRC. So it's a mixed baggage.
Right, and I might just add, perhaps gratuitously, that Kagame doesn't look so benevolent if you're an opposition journalist in Rwanda.
Right.
Jenny, one obvious place that we have not yet mentioned is Russia, which has an election coming up that it's always hard to know how seriously to take a Russian election these days, but there is a new anti-war candidate, Boris Nadezhdin, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, blocked from his attempt, last we knew, to run in the March presidential election, but it was a new opponent popping up to Vladimir Putin, and I wonder if the assumption in Europe and the UK is just that everyone has to sit idly by and watch Putin get reincarnated in Russia.
Well, I think the assumption is a pretty safe bet that Putin will be re-elected. And one of the things that I always goes through my mind in these situations under Putin is to feel immediately sorry for the person who has the courage to stand up against him because there are so many terrible stories of the way in which the opposition is treated. But they do have to be obviously supported, congratulated for that courage. I think the worry is that in some ways, in order to make his point and to make himself more attractive to his electors, Putin might be planning some major show of force, additional show of force in Ukraine. There might be a ramping up of what is happening there, or turning his attention to other parts of Eastern Europe. I saw a headline today that the Prime Minister of Estonia is now on his hit list. Now that is no surprise, but it is obviously a ramping up of the political temperature in that region. The whole of Europe is worried. It's worried about Russia, obviously worried about Eastern Europe and the threat of Putin and the situation in Ukraine. Worried about Trump because of his undermining of NATO, and that has serious implications, obviously, for security in Europe, and worried about the way in which democracy copes with the current challenges of, I would say, the twin challenges, but they're linked, of the wave of immigration that European countries are dealing with, which is, I believe, the reason probably for the drift to the right. And very linked with that immigration, the challenges of climate change in some of the, particularly in some of the poorer parts of the world. So although Europe may be sounding quite secure in comparison with some of the countries we've been talking about, I think we've got Europe is justified in being worried about a change in the balance of democracy within the world. And there's a report going to the Munich Security Conference this week that says that 72% of the world's population now lives in autocracies. 10 years ago, that was 46%. The balance is shifting rapidly.
That's a startling figure. I think this is a good point to turn back to Mike Scott, who's been waiting patiently. I see he has quite a few questions accumulated amongst our audience. Mike, are you? Do you want to handle some of those
yes,
now?
I'm coming. That's it. Well, what a conversation so far. It's particularly what you've just said, Jenny. Where do we go to from there? But let me come to some of the questions that have come in from Kamendi Mali. How might the outcome of these elections influence the trajectory of international relations, trade agreements, and diplomatic alliances on a global scale? In a sense, it's following on from what you said, Jenny, but can I go to Lou for that to start?
Well, what we're seeing in the world is greater diversity and many more countries critical for making decisions. We're no longer in a unipolar world or a multipolar world. We're in a world that I'd like to call multiplex, in which you can just see with the alliance that the United States has pulled together to try to confront Russia and Ukraine, many more countries have to be taken seriously. And leaders want to be pragmatic. The there's been trouble with COVID that caused trade to decline. Trade has picked up again. And big question is the global trading relations becoming totally chaotic, or are the current trade relations actually stable, despite the fact there isn't a World Trade Organization to pull everything together? I and two colleagues have done a study of all of the treaties that have been signed in the world since 1945, and we've discovered that even though there aren't multilateral treaties holding everything together, the bilateral treaties that have come out maintain that pragmatic pattern. So while I think that Jenny's absolutely correct that we need to be worried, if we're not worried, we're in big trouble. I think that there's room to be optimistic that the world can move ahead, but there are some critical things that have to happen. The United States is a very important country to play a constructive role. I think that Jenny's correct to be concerned that if Donald Trump were to win again, things would be troubled. I also think that focusing on democracy might, all by itself, might not be the very best thing to do. I think we have to focus on governance. And the case of Rwanda is a really good example. There's been very effective governance there with Kagame, but a total failure, as Moses says, in terms of long-term, because there's no successor. So looking to a broader category of governance and looking at democracy within that, I think might be a better way to frame how we think things are going. So I'm, like Jenny, worried. If anyone's not worried, I don't know what world they're living in, but I'm also optimistic.
Thanks for that. So I'm going to go on to another question, and it comes from Carol, who says, something deeper referred to by Fernando really depends on an extension of education. How far is education expansion a feature of parties' manifestos around the world? Fernando, do you want to start with that?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Gosh, that's a very big question. Education is I see it now as a two-edged sword, because it's become very instrumentalized. And you see it very much in the way in which university curricula are moving. You know, that they're very, very worried about the self-criticism that you expect in universities. So from that perspective, I think I would change the angle slightly, and to go back to the question of Russia, for instance. Where, I mean, obviously we see Russia as very problematic because of what's going on in Ukraine and the whole rhetoric that is being put across. But if you try to get inside the message that Putin is putting across in Russia itself, we need to ask ourselves why it's so convincing to the Russians. You know, this idea that they are the victims of Western aggression, that he can demonstrate that the West has gone back on its word on several things regarding NATO, that obviously they feel that the advance of Western values, as far as Russia is concerned, is really depriving them of very, very important spiritual foundations. If you look at it from that perspective, and then you go back to what I said at the beginning of the crisis of humanist culture in the years just after the First World War, expressed by T.S. Eliot so well, I suddenly remembered that the really interesting people who were analyzing the malaise at the time were Russian. You know, the people that came out of the school of Solovyov, and especially Nikolai Verdyaev, who is the one who actually saw the poverty of metaphysical convictions in the West. And he insisted that without that, you wouldn't have convincing democracies. So all the values that came out of the humanist tradition were in crisis precisely because of the collapse of philosophical and metaphysical thinking. Rigorous philosophical and metaphysical thinking. He pointed to the very interesting paradox that at the beginning of humanism, before the triumphs of industrialization, all the thinkers back in the 16th century, people like, you know, in the 15th century, Pico de la Mirandola, and the 17th century, someone like Campanella were praising humanity and the power of human beings and how wonderful they could be. And then when all that was achieved, towards the end of the 19th century, you have the despair of Zola and people like that, just talking about naturalism and how everything was leading to nihilism, really. And the solution, according to Berdyaev and a lot of people who read him at the time, was that we needed to go deeper and analyze the crisis really as what it is, which is a spiritual crisis. It's not an economic or a political crisis. And without addressing those values, it's very, very difficult to know how we're going to address the issues of populism that are plaguing politics nowadays, and that I think we're in danger of going the way in which things went in the 1930s, and that would be pretty disastrous. So how to solve that is a very, I think governments need to be aware of the need to inject more energy into education as a whole, you know, how to educate whole human beings rather than how to educate them merely as technocrats who will go and vote in an election. And again, you know, you can see that.
Yeah, a lot of people would agree with you on that, I'm sure, Fernando. Nancy, have you got a view of this, on the education issue?
I really love what Lo and Fernando talked about, and I also concur with Jenny about many of the issues in Europe. And you know, I have family members living in Europe. They were also worried by, you know, both the United States and also Russia. So the thing that I agree with Lou is the good governance part. So I think democracy alone isn't. I support his view that democracy alone won't be able to solve many of the problems we are facing. It's governance. And then they can promise a lot of things on the campaign trail. But if they cannot deliver, to deliver those promises, and then people, the voters, are going to be very disenchanted. And in the long run, democracy, in order to survive, it must pay attention to governance. And especially not only just governance, it has to be good governance and how to deliver what they promised, and then also work with other countries. I think that in the last, you know, 6-7 decades, the emphasis was mostly on the democracy itself, but ignored governance. And I think if in the future we could put that piece into the discussions, that would be great. When it comes to Donald Trump, I wanted to share two concepts. I'm not sure if any of you have heard this one from Harvard professor Graham Allison. When he was talking about the Trump phenomenon, he offered these two terms, and I thought it would be kind of useful for us. So the one is the Trump hedge. Trump hedge is easy to understand, which sees that Trump's you know, possibility of when he becomes the president of the United States, countries like Europe, especially EU and some of the NATO countries, which heard Trump's disparaging comments about the organizations, are already considering hedging strategies, which is including Germany, France, and Poland have just, the heads have just met and to say, what are we going to be doing? We need a second life insurance, right? So that is part of the impact on the, you know, the importance of the United States, US elections to Europe. The other concept is a very interesting one. It's called Trump put. Put is a concept from the stock market, which basically says if you think that the situation is going to be better with Trump becoming the president, for example, for Russia, and then there will be delaying any negotiations or deals until Trump becomes the presidency. Regardless of which one of the strategies the rest of the world is adopting, it's really disastrous for the United States, for U.S. diplomacy. So I wanted to add that part into our discussions. Regarding education, and I think that education is important, but at this point, I think professors, often I heard from colleagues, and afraid of saying certain things in classrooms because they're afraid of angering one side or the other, and then they may be asked to resign or something like that. So when professors feel their job security is on the line, and then I think the fundamental ones is the values in the society, and I think that cannot be solved simply in classrooms and in college campuses. It's a bigger societal problem, and the society have to come together and solve that issue.
Thanks for that. I'm going to go on to another issue, which is raised by Corinne Demali again, who says, with a focus on environmental policies and climate change becoming increasingly prominent, how do you anticipate the election results will impact global efforts towards sustainability and environmental conservation? I'll go first to Moses on that, and then I'll come back to Jenny. Moses. You're muted, Moses.
Yes, I think the global effort to dealing with many of the environmental challenges is where it ought to be. But we also need to understand that there isn't a difference between a lot of the economic and sometimes social problems that many countries face from the environmental issues that they also confront. So in that case, dealing with the environmental issues, you're also dealing with the many economic and social issues that many countries face. In fact, migration that we see a lot of it today to Europe, to North America, and so forth. Most of the root causes are from environmental problems, and most of the root causes of the environmental problems that generate them are also economic problems. And so the world needs to confront the two issues, and in confronting the two issues, also need to ensure that we have resources, sent to most of the vulnerable societies and most of the poorer societies that do not have the capabilities of generating the resources that will enable them to be a lot more able to conserve their ecosystems, and therefore also generate a lot of the wealth that they need to sustain themselves.
Thanks,
in which
Moses.
case, therefore,
sorry, go on. Jenny, can I ask you to come in on that?
Yes, certainly. I think as we progress with increasing concern about the impact of our behavior on climate change, as there is increasing public awareness of this across the world, we are facing very difficult decisions. And it is undoubtedly true that democracy is easier in the good times. And we are not in good times at this point. And the issues of climate change are very, very urgent. What is absolutely clear, and referring to what Moses has just said, the less developed countries rightly point to the much bigger impact of the richer countries, the much bigger environmental footprint of the richer countries of the world. So what we have is a global sense of injustice about the way in which we have behaved and we are continuing to behave. And even when you get within the domestic politics of the richer countries, you find leaders tend to shy away and draw back when it comes to some of the most difficult decisions. In Britain, our own Prime Minister has done this within the last few months. He's gone fuzzy and soft on some of the more challenging decisions. And across Europe, there is every sign that populist right-wing parties are homing in on climate change issues as a key part of their programme. Now, the net result for the world is seriously worrying. And of course, the people who will suffer most are the poorest.
Thanks for that. So I'm going to move on to Angela Fesson, who says, with the rise of social media, the world seems more masculine and harsh. What percentage do you think social media plays in decreasing democratic values? Who wants to take, Lou, do you want to take that?
Well,
Jenny?
I was going to fill the gap by saying one of the things that surprised me, and this is just a short point really, is we were referring back to our earlier conversation about the state of public opinion in Russia. I have been consistently surprised at the fact that the government line there has held and has been so all-pervasive, because it really shows up that even in a country with a good level of education, social media has not produced global influence, global viewpoint. It is still possible for public opinion to remain isolated. And I'm sure others will have a lot to add to that.
So I
Okay,
can,
Lou.
I can say that, in the West, this notion that Russians have that they are victims and have been victims for hundreds of years, which Fernando pointed out, is common sense to Russians. It's something that that has been part of their national identity for many, many years. And one of the big tasks for the North Atlantic community and for the allies in Asia is to find a place for Russia in the world that doesn't have that. In the short term, however, what social media has done is it's created a new mechanism for communication between leaders and the population overall. And it's a mechanism that's really changed the nature of political systems over the last 10, 15 years. It's sort of like what lobbyists started to do in the 1920s. And it took a long time for governments to get a handle on how to control the way lobbyists distort politics, and they didn't get a full handle on that. So this is the nature of our political system. And there are struggles within a range of countries about how to regulate social media, how to regulate lobbyists, to be able to create better governance and better leadership overall. And I just want to point out that we draw these parallels to World War I. At Versailles, people were very aware of the consequences of a punitive settlement for Germany. The United States and other nations were arguing against a punitive solution, but Georges Clemenceau, the foreign minister of France, pushed his vindictive punitive solution because of his memory of the Franco-Russian War that ended up with disaster. The Georges Clemenceau of today is Donald Trump. And we can have good leadership and good governance, or we can have good education and good governance, but leadership is also very, very important.
Thanks for that, Lou. Yeah. Moses, you want?
Yeah, I wanted to also add to that. We remember the Arab Spring, and we probably should also remember that most of the agitation for democracy and for democratic participation, and many of the autocracies that were in Africa really came as a result of the use of social media. Now, social media has also been abused the use of social media to misinform people or disinformation and so forth. So the question therefore should be, how do we balance both? I don't really know, but I think that's something that policy would really need to do. If you can really trace the sources of disinformation, and or if you can hold certain organizations accountable for disinformation, while at the same time opening up the space for the use of social media. In fact, it will be very, very advantageous to democratic governance.
Thanks for that, Moses. I'm going to have to bring this to an end now. I'm sorry there was a question from Josh Chandler that I wasn't able to ask, but we did get a little bit of an answer to it within the conversation about Russia. But thanks, Josh, for that. Sandy, is there anything you want to say before I wind it all up? You're on mute, Sandy.
We're under pressure to get out on time today. And I want to thank all of these wonderful panelists for their insightful contributions to the discussion. I'm not sure I go away from the conversation as an optimist, but I think a realist would have to understand that some very difficult times lie ahead. Thanks to John McCabe, who works with me in Washington on the Free Speech Project, and all of our students who keep us well informed about these issues. I would note that Mike's and my partnership on these programs next month will be our 40th monthly program in this series. And we're not completely sure yet of the topic, but we regard that as a great accomplishment. We appreciate what all of you have contributed to it. Over to you, Mike.
Okay, thanks to you, Sandy, and I agree. Thank to Jenny, Fernando, Nancy, Lou, and Moses. It's been a wonderful discussion, though a sober discussion today. And thanks everybody who sent in messages. Sorry that they weren't all asked, but thank you very much for your questions. As we say, the next free speech project of the Crossroads International Dialogues in association with the Future Humanities Project will be in March, probably on the 13th of March. And one of the things we're talking about is uses and abuses of language. We're going to firm that up a little bit more over the next weeks. And in relation, I think, Sandy, to what's been said today, I think there's a continuation in terms of some of the issues raised today. I want to say, though, that if it's on the 13th of March, or when it's in March, it'll be at 11 a.m. EST, but that will mean that it'll be at 3 p.m. In the UK, because clocks change in the USA, but they won't have changed in the UK. So in that period, we just watch the time, will you? Especially in the UK, it might be an hour earlier, because we're later than the US. I also want to mention that there's another Zoom on Monday, the 26th of February, when Dr. Alexa Jobin from George Washington University will be talking about worldwide encounters with Shakespeare, but in that books that have made a difference, cultural encounters. So you're going to look at the worldwide. She's a terrific expert on that area. So I do encourage you to tune in Monday the 26th. For today, my thanks to colleagues at Georgetown, particularly the President, Jack DeJoya, and the Vice President of Global Affairs, Tom Banchoff. Now, my thanks also to people at Blackfriars, John O'Connor, the Regent, and Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute. My thanks to John McCabe, also to my wife Maggie, who helps set these things up from this side of the Atlantic. Thank you all for attending today and for your support of our various series. I'm Professor Mike Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott or LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott. Until then, the next time, bye-bye, and thank you for being with us. Bye-bye.